What's going on, everyone? Thank you for joining us here at Apisecure 2023. Hopefully all of you enjoyed the opening keynote from Dr. Katie Paxton-Fear. Like I said, we have an awesome lineup of speakers here on the red track today, and I am super honored to introduce our next speaker, who is an amazing API penetration tester, amazing pen tester in general. And I'm proud to also call her a good friend of mine. Gabby, I'd like to bring her on stage. Gabby is an ethical hacker, award-winning penetration tester, board member at APIsecure University, speaker. She's also a mentor on the SYNAC Artemis Red Team. Just an all-around incredibly cool cat. Let me go ahead and Fabio, can you bring Gabby on the stage? Awesome. Cool. Good to see you, Gabby.
Good to see you too, Alisa. It's been a while.
I know. Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, I actually had the honor of giving her award at this year's, or I should say last year's Black Hat, for the Cybersecurity Woman Hacker of the Year. I can't imagine a more deserving person to have won that award. And I just, anytime I'm doing anything with hacking, she's my first thought that comes to mind. So I'm so glad to have you here, Gabby. I don't like it when people give my bios, so I will shut up and let you do your own bio and introduce yourself to the audience. And thanks for being a speaker with us this year again.
Thank you very much, Alisa. So I'm going to start. So thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm very, very happy to be here. And I'm going to start by presenting myself. So I'm Gabrielle Botbol. I'm an offensive security consultant for Desjardins, and I'm a member of SYNAC Artemis Red Team, like Alisa said. Besides my professional activity, I'm involved in the cybersecurity community. I'm part of multiple advisory boards, everything was said before, so I'm just going to today say that I'm going to first present how I trained myself to become a pen tester, and then I will briefly present what is Android and what is Android app pen test and API pen test. So we will dive first into how to set up the lab, and then how to pen test Android app and APIs. And finally, I will give you a link where you will find all the resources that are mentioned on the slide, including the slides as well. So I want to take some time to tell you how my blog became a personal brand. So for the record, I studied literature to become an actress, but I've always been passionate about computers. And so 10 years ago, I turned this passion into a job by becoming an application developer. And even if I liked this job very much, I was morally torn as for the security of the applications I was delivering to the customer, because at the time, as a developer, you were not really responsible for the security of what you created. That's how it was. I feel like it's better now. So that's why I started to get interested in cybersecurity, and I discovered pen testing. And for practical and economical reason, I trained myself to become a pen tester, and I documented all of this in a blog. And so the goal of this blog was to get hired as a pen tester. So it's true that it was a risk because it was outside the traditional model, but risk is part of any business. So to build my program, I relied on an education science concept that you can see on the screen. It's called apprenance. I'll let you a few seconds to read. And so I drew inspiration from academic programs. I compare them with skills mentioned in job postings. And so this concept that is inspired by lifelong learning allowed me to create a path in 6 steps with CTF, conferences, tutorials, internships, summer schools, and volunteering. And so the CTF was to learn by doing. The conferences was to have a different point of view and approach cybersecurity from all angles. And MOOCs and tutorial was to support the practice of CTF with theory. And summer school was to have a contact with the academic and professional world and meet experts in the field. And volunteering was to meet other cybersecurity enthusiasts. And finally, the internship was to put all of this learning into practice. So to this program, I added an analysis grid of skills that was listing the skills I got from my previous positions. And these skills that we call transferable skills are applicable to the cybersecurity field. So for example, when I was a receptionist, I learned how to anticipate and how to pay close attention to detail and provide a good customer service. So now we are going to dive into Android. So what is Android? Android is a mobile operating system that is based on a modified version of the kernel Linux, and it's developed by Google. So the most used language for Android app is Java, but since 2019, the official language is Kotlin. So other than those, you can use language like C++ or Python, for example, but they will not be fully supported. And also it's worth mentioning that Kotlin is a simplified version of Java. So we have...
Hey, Gabby, sorry to interrupt you, but your slides are not changing. I just want to let you know. We're still looking at your front title slide.
That's odd. I'm going to stop sharing and reshare again. Can I do this?
Maybe it got stuck. Want to make sure everyone's getting the full Gabby experience. There we go. I think I see your there we go.
Oh,
it's,
okay.
It's the
Yeah. So we should be good. Yes, it seems to work. So this is the program I mentioned. And so I just want to go back a little to this so that you can have a look at the quote I was mentioning on how I trained myself. So this is the concept I used to train myself. So let's get back to this. And thank you for letting me know, because without the slides, it's definitely not the same. So the Android architecture is divided into 5 main layers. And so we have the Linux kernel layer. So this layer is basically what provides the basic system functionality and all the hardware abstraction. So it includes device, drivers, memory management, process management, you name it. And so you also have the second layer, that is the native libraries layer. So it contains mostly a set of C and C++ libraries that will provide the core functionality of the Android operating system. So this would include library for graphic rendering or multimedia playback or things like this. And you also have the Android runtime layer. So this layer includes the Dalvik virtual machine. So this VM is responsible for running Android applications. So it's optimized for mobile devices, and it uses a compilation approach to maximize performance. And so then we have the application framework layer. And so this layer provides the APIs and tools that the developer will use to create Android application. And there's a wide range of components like activities, services, content providers, and finally the application layer. So this is where applications like contact, games, and any other applications are installed. So now that this is cleared up, I'm going to dive into explaining the pen test of an Android application. So Android app pen test, along with mobile pen test, is a type of pen test that is part of the list that we usually provide as pen testers. But most of pen testers are generalists, so they will provide, for example, network or Wi-Fi and web pen test. But some also like to specialize in pen test, like mobile, like API and cloud, and so many others. So Android app pen test is different from other pen tests because most of the time we will get an executable that we will have to analyze. But for example, when we are pen testing a web application, what mostly happens is that we are going to be given a URL, and sometimes, depending on the methodology used, we will have an account on the platform. And also for external pen test, we will get an IP address, and we rarely have to investigate an executable or analyze code, except if we stumble upon something. So why Android app pen test? Okay, so this is 2022, July 13th to be exact. And so even if Google Play carefully chooses the application for the store, we still have many Android applications that are vulnerable. And so on the 13th of July last year, a few applications by KB Tech were installed 3 million times on Android. And so these applications were a malware family, and it was subscribing its user to premium services. So it took 6 months for Google to remove some of the applications of this company. And so Android pen tests are also important because Android is the mobile OS the most attacked in the world. And it is not only used for phones. You can find it in smartwatch, you can find it in cars, and many more. And also another thing I wanted to mention is that you will see installations and commands on the screen. So you might not remember all of this because it's really commands. But as I mentioned, you will be able to have my slides in my Git book. So these are some figures that I found really impressive. Mobile apps are more and more targeted. So we have 75% of phishing sites that are specifically aimed for mobile devices. There's also this huge increase of exploited zero-day on mobile vulnerabilities. So yeah, it's I really think it's worth having a look at these figures. So next one is so the APIs. You know, a lot of developers will use API to develop their Android applications. So because it has a lot of advantages, it gives access to remote data because API will provide developer with a way to access and manipulate data from remote servers, databases, and web services. And so by using APIs, developer can retrieve data such as, for example, weather forecast or social media updates or news feed or any other kind of data that would be useful for their application. So this also allow to integrate third-party services like also payment gateways, like cloud storage services. And so this is a standardized way to integrate these services, and this enable them to access their features and functionality. Also, it can improve the application performance of Android application because it will reduce the amount of data that needs to be transferred between the app and the server. And so APIs can enable developers to request only the data that they need. And so it can help reduce the load on the server and improve the app's response time. Also for code reuse, so it's also good because it provides developer with a way to reuse code and functionality that is already available on the server. So instead of writing code from scratch to implement certain features or functionality, developer can actually use API to access pre-existing code and functionality. And so this is definitely going to save time and effort. And finally, it also provides flexibility and scalability because this is going to separate the app's front end from the back end. And so developers can modify or update the backend functionality without having to make changes to the front end. So this can help make the app more flexible and scalable. And so also what they can do is make their own APIs because it can provide them with more control over the data and functionality that is exposed to their app. And also it will allow them to have more customization and improve performance. And also this will allow them to monetize their API. So now, what is the Android pen test process? So first we have to plan it with the customer. We have to define the legal matters and so everything. So this is like the planning phase. And also, as usual, there is a reconnaissance phase. So in our case, it would involve having a look at the information you can get from the app with Google Play. So maybe doing some reconnaissance on the company or the customer and so on. And then we have the static analysis. So we will have a look at the code and check for specific element there. And then with the dynamic analysis, we will intercept traffic and look for vulnerabilities this way. And finally, we will have to make a report to present and explain our findings. But I will explain the last 3 steps, so static analysis, dynamic analysis, and report in more details later. So the lab is very, it's like a bigger part than for other pen test type. So I think it's important, so that's why I took a few slides to explain how to install a lab. So these are the tools that you will need. JADIC is a tool that you will decompile the code of the app, and then you will be able to analyze this for the static analysis phase. APK tool will go further than JADIC because you will be able to reverse engineer APK files, because Android can decode APK file, but it can also allow you to make modification, and then you have to when you have to make your changes, you can use and recompile the modified code and resources back into an APK file. So it's pretty great. You will also have another step that you will need to sign the application after so that it can be used. And then ADB is the command line tool that will let you interact with an Android device or a virtual machine. Android Studio is going to allow you to have a VM and interact with it. You could use a physical device, but for our lab, we are going to use Android Studio. And Burp Suite will allow you to be able to intercept request and response. So those are the commands I mentioned. So the setup is made for Ubuntu, but you can also check out the resources at the end of the matrix here for other systems. So in order to install JADIC, you need to have Java installed. So this is why the commands here are going to install Java for you. And then you can type the command on the screen. So the last one will launch it. And then for ADB, you can use the command on the screen as well. And for APK tool, you will have a detailed explanation on the link I provided, depending on your OS, and Android Studio and Burp Suite. So it's really pretty straightforward also. So just go to the link and download, and you just have to install depending on your system. But this should give you a pretty decent lab. So the first thing I want to show you is how to create an emulator with Android Studio. So I'm just going to check that you are able to see my video. Yes, you are. It's perfect. So you have to go to Android Virtual Device Manager, and then you can choose to add a virtual device. And basically, you can choose any thing you like if you like a big screen, or it really depends on how you're comfortable. And then you have to choose an API level. So you have to look at the Android manifest. I will give more detail later, but this will help you to find the image you need, because the API is going to be mentioned in the manifest. So you have to choose one image that is convenient for your context. And then you click next, and then you give it a name, because as you can see, I have plenty of different virtual devices, so it's good to be able to recognize them. Okay, give it a better name though, because this one is not really good. And then you should be good to go, and you can launch it. And it takes a while, so I'm gonna put this a little faster. But you should be welcomed by this screen here, and you should be good to go. Okay, and so for the next step, this is how to set up the lab and configure Burp. So I just want to say before showing you this video that certificate pinning is out of the scope for this presentation, but I do have links for you. I have a practical example on my Gitbook, and I have a tutorial also on my Gitbook that you can use. And those are two challenges from Hack the Box that were involving to bypass certificate pinning. So how to set up the lab with Burp? So first you go to the option type. You have to import the CA certificate. You take DER, and then you select a file. You put it in a folder where you can find it easily after, because you're going to have to drag and drop it, and you give it the CER extension. And then you just have to close, and you have the certificate. Now you can drag and drop it in the virtual machine. Okay, so it's been copied. And now you have to install it on the device. So you have to go to settings. It's usually in security. It depends on the image of Android you will have, but most of the time you are going to find it on security, and you can install it from SD card. You go to internal storage. It's actually not downloads, it's internal storage, and you have a download folder in here. And then you're going to have to install it this way. So you give it a name that you will remember. Usually Burp is the best choice. And then you will have to select and create a PIN. So just create a PIN code with a safer password than me. And okay, I usually don't show notifications, but it doesn't matter. And it's installed. So now you have to go to the settings and to put the settings, the proxy settings in the virtual machine. So first you need to go back to Burp and select all interface and bind it to a port that you will remember. So I usually take 8082. And then you need, so you have to make sure that it is working here. And then you have to change the settings. You can do it from here. You can also do it from the phone as well, like the graphical interface of the phone. And so make sure that everything is set up properly. I did set it before, but also what is important is to make sure that you click apply, because any changing you will make will not be registered or recorded if you don't put apply. Okay. And this is supposed to be working. So you just need to check if it's working, just put yes. And you see that our request to Google has been intercepted. So we're good to go. So next, so I use these vulnerable applications for the example. So you can get them on these links here. So for example, PIVA means purposefully insecure and vulnerable Android application, which is very hard to say with my French accent, and injured Android. And so the URLs to get them, you can have them here. And also, you must always have the authorization of the owner before testing your system, because if you go to the dynamic analysis, you are actually going to be on the server, so be careful. So for the static analysis, we have to check the Android manifest and strings.xml. And we can also enumerate databases, and you can find some tools on GitHub that can help you for this purpose. And of course, we need to check for sensitive data. So first, I'm going to show some example in the Android manifest file. So before we do that, I want to be a little more precise on how to check the code. So you just have to, if you're using JADX, you just have to do JADX and launch it this way, and you're going to have the GUI. Or you can already decompile the application with APK tool, and APK tool will have all these files here that you will see. It should look something like this. So an example with Piva. So this file is, what is Android Manifest? It's the place where developers will describe essential information about the app. So it is used by the Android system before it launches the application to know what component exists. So this will be used to mention the app package name, like I mentioned before, the component of the app, the permissions, and the hardware and software the app needs. And so it's also useful for us to check out which API we need in our lab to test the application. So we can know this information by having a look at the min SDK version option. And on the screen, you can see a list of all the permissions required on Piva. And as the goal of permission is to protect the privacy of the user, you might see some permission here that should not be allowed, depending, of course, on the purpose of the application. But for instance, if we were testing a social media app, there would be no need to make calls or no need to record the audio. So this is typically something you have to mention in a report. You can also see on the screen a list of all the permissions that you can specify in the manifest. And there's also a list to all the dangerous permissions to check, because, well, I don't think Piva should be able to record the call, for example. So, or I mean, access the phone call. So this is something you should not, you should put on your report. But for example, in the Kelitech malware app family I mentioned before, the application had permission to read the text message. And so this is how it was possible to subscribe the user to unwanted services. So you need to make sure that your customer, and by the customer, I mean the developer, you need to make sure that they really need a specific permission, especially if it's one of the dangerous permissions that is on the list, on OWASP list. So the allow backup is a flag that could allow an attacker to take the backup of an app with data with ADB. So it would be safer to put it as false. And in the, as mentioned in the OWASP documentation, you have the link of the screen. Is this attribute is not set up, it's enabled by default. So, and in our example in Piva, it is set to true. And the debuggable flag. So this flag will mention if the app can be debugged. It should be set to false, otherwise an attacker could use it to access the app data. But it is usually false by default, but sometimes your customer will give you the developer version of the application, so this flag will be set to true. So what I usually do in this case is that I'm going to mention it as informational in my report as a reminder, you know, for the customer to make sure that they will change this when they will deliver the app in production. And in our example in Piva, it is set to true. So how to find, so during the static analysis, we can do something which is find the API endpoints. You can use a tool like Apisecure tool to decompile the application and extract the source code. And once you have the source code, you can search for keywords like HTTP or HTTPS. You can look for functions or classes to handle network request and response. I will show an example of what it could look like in the code in the next slide. And also, you need to also analyze the application manifest file, so the Android manifest.xml, and the application API package contains metadata about the application, including the declared permission, the services, the activities. So you can look for permissions related to network communication. So this will also help to identify API endpoints. And also analyzing the application's JavaScript file. So if the application uses WebView or the Android interface definition language for inter-process communication, you can analyze the JavaScript file or the AIDL file to identify API endpoints. And I will also show you an example of this in the next slide in JavaScript. So, so this is the first example. This is an example of how the APIs are called. So this is what it looks like in the code. So this code defines an asynchronous task that makes a GET request to an API endpoint, and it returns the response as a string. So for those of you who might not know what an asynchronous task is in Android, so this is a way to perform a long-running operation in the background without blocking the user interface thread. So when an Android application performs a task that takes a long time to complete, like in our case, it's going to be making an API call, it can cause the UI to become unresponsive. So an asynchronous task will allow you to perform these types of tasks in a separate thread. And so this way, the UI will still be responsive and interactive. And so, for example, we could use in an asynchronous task to load a large file. So the next slide. So this is an Android application that uses a web view to display a web page. So the web page contains JavaScript code that communicates with API to fetch data. So in this example, the JavaScript code defines a function called fetch data that makes a GET request to an API endpoint at http api.example.com/data. So this is a pretty obvious scheme for an API. And so next slide is, yes, let's talk about hard-coded secret, because this is something really, so this vulnerability is a huge win, and it's including API keys. So sometimes during the static analysis, we can find hard-coded API keys. And so this article on the left is an example of this. Lots of Android apps still have hard-coded secrets in the code. And another example is this video, because here, not only Alisa found a key, it was a private key with a blind password. So we will see an example of a key in an XML file in the next slide. Oh, sorry about that. Okay. I will share also the link to the video because it's really, really good. So if we go back to injured Android and check the strings.xml file, there we go. We have an hard-coded API key right here. Okay, so it's definitely something you have to report. So next slide. So this is the general tip for static analysis. So what is useful is to use the search on JEDEX GUI and look up for secret credentials, comments, URL, IP address. I mean, any sensitive information that should not be in the code. So what you can do with JEDEX is you can use the global search to look up for specific strings, like, for example, API, API underscore key, password, client ID, you know, basically anything. So here is a quick video on how to use it. So it's really quick, so I'm not going to put it in full screen. Oh, yes, I'm just going to put it in full screen. It's better because it's very small. So this is just, you click here, and then you type your text, and it will show you the result. And that's basically it. You will have it this way. Okay, also another way that I wanted to mention is using Apica tool. It is just sometimes much more simple to make a grep directly in the decompiled code. This is what I prefer to do. You can also, if you use mobsf, grep in the folder where mobsf decompiles the code. And if you want more tips on grep, you can check this link on my Git book here. I have plenty of useful Linux commands, including some explanations on grep. So what you would do is grep-r, and so look for anything. So I just put unsafe secret, but you can put anything like API or HTTPS if you're looking for an endpoint. And APK tool. This is to decompile the app. And so the directory is the /uploads for mobsf. Okay, so here are some useful tools for static analysis. So Firebase Anim is useful to find Firebase instance. Firebase Scanner is going to check for misconfigurations, and Cloud Anim is going to check for cloud instances for different cloud providers. So this way we can try to enumerate databases or public resources in clouds, and sometimes you could even find AWS secret key, so you could try to use it to access the resource on AWS. So this is definitely something that would be worth mentioning in the report. And this is very, very similar to what we just seen before. So next is dynamic analysis. So the dynamic analysis part is the part where you are going to intercept the traffic with burp and analyze the traffic. So during this phase, you can check for tab jacking. So it's going to be like click jacking, but for mobile app. And you can also check if you are able to capture screens that contain sensitive data. And of course, you can check the OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities. So I'm going to show you an example of a vulnerability we can find during dynamic analysis. But first, I'm going to make a small point about APIs and how to find API endpoint in the dynamic analysis. So with the application network traffic, you can use Burp Suite and you can analyze the traffic to identify the endpoint. And on the screen, you can see what it would look like. So these are some examples, but I really, what is efficient is to use a word list and fuzz for possible endpoints. So there is a link to a word list of possible endpoints in the screen, but really there are plenty of these lists on the internet. So this is the vulnerability I mentioned. So this is a background capture. I'm just going to put it in full screen. So this is focused on information disclosure when a screen is sent to the background. So let's say, for the sake of the example, let's just say that this page here, let's pretend that this is like a detail, like this is a bank application, and this is a detail of your account and what you have on your bank account. So I just go, and then I open another app, any app, and then I go back, and then I click here, and I see that it's been recorded, and I can access again the application. So this is something that you have to report. Okay, next slide. So automatic tools, there are, it's like with any other pen test. You can use automatic tools. It can be useful if you want to gain some time. However, I have to say, as usual, that it does not replace your eyes, your critical thinking, and your brain, and we cannot only rely on those. So this means that you need to verify every finding to avoid false positive, and also check for other things that an automatic tool could not detect. So this tool, however, these two tools on the screen are really convenient because MobSF, as I mentioned just a little before, it will conduct a complete scan, and it's going to automate the static analysis phase, and it will check the permission, it will check the encryption of the traffic, it will look for possible buffer overflows, hard-coding secret, and you can also use it for dynamic analysis. Quark is a tool that is capable of finding common security vulnerabilities in Android applications, and it can also create a proof of concept. So for instance, you can use it for tab jacking evidence. So some general tips on what API vulnerabilities to look for. One that I often find during mobile assessment is the broken object level authorization, which is BOLA in short. So this vulnerability will allow you to access to resources that do not belong to you. So I recommend checking for these vulnerabilities. And I also provided the link to the OWASP repo with all the API vulnerabilities from the OWASP 2019 top 10. And if you want more detailed tips for API and pen tests, you can also check my Git book. You also have to be careful. For one thing, it is that sometimes you could find a vulnerability that would be exploitable in the context of a web application, but not of a mobile application. So an example of this is the CORS vulnerability, cross-origin resource sharing. So this is a mechanism that allows web application to make requests to a different origin than the one which the application has served. In the context of an Android application, CORS is not applicable because Android applications do not run in a web browser environment. However, if the Android application interacts with a web service or an API that implements CORS, this may be vulnerable to a CORS-related attack. So an attacker could use a malicious website to perform a cross-origin request to the API, and this way access sensitive information or even execute unauthorized actions on behalf of the user. So this is why this is why context is really important, you have to see and you have to check every vulnerabilities. You have to see how they can be applicable to your context. And when you have a doubt about something because you lack information on the context or you lack time, just report it as informational. So also, general tips on pen test is using a checklist. It is always useful to use a checklist and make sure to have the check for the OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities in it. An amazing tool to use for this purpose is Mind API by David Sopas. So you have a link on the screen. And the picture you see above it is a snippet of a checklist for a pen test GraphQL API. You can find the book Black Hat GraphQL by Nick Alex and Dolef Fari, and they actually provide a huge checklist for GraphQL API. And on the OWASP Mass website, you have a downloadable checklist, and you can have the link also here. And so there are multiple advantages to using a checklist because it provides a way to make a consistent and standardized pen test. It allows you to make sure that you cover every aspect of what you are testing, and it helps you to stay organized because when you are pen testing, you can easily stray away and it can become messy, but with a checklist, you have a guideline to avoid this, and you make sure that what you did, that you did not forget anything, because I know that when I do some pen tests, sometimes I'm so focused on a specific vulnerabilities that I might forget to check for others. So this way, with my checklist, I can know that I checked everything. And also it can serve as a detailed record for the testing you conducted, and so it can be used as a documentation if you want to provide it. And finally, it makes you more efficient, and it helps you gain time in different steps of the pen test process. So how about the report? So how to report? So here is the usual structure of any pen test report. So the executive summary is the part addressed to the executive of the company who will read your report. So it needs to be a high-level explanation with no technical details, and it has to contain a global posture that explains everything, why the findings and why attack combination could impact the company. And the impact on the company here is very important because they are going to want to know what you find and how the vulnerabilities you found could impact the company. Then we have the vulnerability report. So it will have the elements you see on the screen, and you can use this part of this methodology for a bug bounty report. So the severity is usually in one word: low, medium, high, or critical. The score is usually the CVSS score. Most of the business will use this one, but you can also use the OWASP risk rating scores, and you have calculators for both of them online. You have to give the detail also of the affected item. You have to give a detailed description with technical details on how the flow can be reproduced, and so this has to be technical. And you want the developer or the person who will read it to be able to reproduce the step. Then you have the remediation and then explanation on how to correct it. And finally, you have the evidence, a screen capture, a request, a response, anything that you were able to conduct during the attack phase to have examples and how to reproduce them. So I'm going to give an example on the broken object access control. So here the severity is medium, but you need to change this according to the CVSS score and the context and what you are able to exploit. It can be higher or it can be lower. This is really an example. So this part is really important because it will allow the project team to be aware of the impact it could have in their context. This is also the part where you will need to add the evidence that I mentioned before. So for this vulnerability, it can be a request and response. So first one, it can be with the expected behavior of an application, of the application. So for example, a GET request to fetch data that belongs to you and the resulting response of this request. And then you can add the same modified request you use to exploit the vulnerability and access the data that does not belong to you. And so you have to put how you modify the request and the response you got from this. Finally, on the report, you will need to specify the remediation steps and resources. For more detail on the remediation of the vulnerability, also, this is always it's always good to put more than one link, because I think it's best, because it allows, if your customer didn't really understand what you said, or if you're not clear enough, I hope you will be clear enough, but just in case this happens, you can put many resources, because we don't have also the same way to read or understand things. So it's good to have as many resources as possible. And finally, so you will get these slides and all the resources on this website, which is my Pen Tips Gitbook. And you will find courses, you will find references and read, you will find plenty of bugs and vulnerable apps to practice on. You will also have write-ups of bugs and challenges about Android. You will have resources that I mentioned before for SSL pinning bypass. You will have resources about Smalley, Dalvik, and how to reverse engineer Android applications. You will have tools. You will have resources about Android OS and security. And finally, you will have inspiring talks from experts like Alisa. And so if you want to have a look at an article I wrote for Pentest magazine about Android application pentest. And there's a quiz if you want to have fun and see what you remember. And I want to make a special shout out to APIsecure University. They are amazing. And the course is made by Cory Ball. It's really, really good. And thank you, Alisa, for having me. Thank you, for APIdays team. And that's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gabby. I'm so glad that you covered so many of the topics I wanted to cover. The fact that you brought up reporting, that's something that a lot of speakers, I feel, just kind of overlook, and influencers really overlook when teaching, because you could be the world's best mobile app or mobile API pen tester, but if you don't know how to communicate your findings in a way that the customer or management can understand, I really feel like you're doing a huge disservice to the organization. And I feel like we as hackers typically want to try, and we get too much in the weeds, and we feel like our 0 days or whatever are the most important thing. And at the end of the day, if you can't eloquently or in a detailed way explain your findings and what it means to the business, then you're not doing your entire job.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. You have to be in the team of your customer and help them understand how they can be better and make better security, instead of just come here and break everything.
Yeah. So that was super cool when I saw that. So thank you for covering that. So definitely thank you for referring to my research from 2019. You and I both share a fondness for mobile API testing, especially on the Android side. I don't know. Actually, I should ask you that. So is there a reason that you tend to prefer Android testing versus, like, for example, iOS?
I feel like Android is, everybody, like most of the people will have an Android device, because it's sometimes cheaper. Yeah. And so I want, this is really, I want everyone to be secure. So I felt like this was more broad, and this will be involving more people. So this is
and I think I don't know, keep me honest here, but I think Android even has a majority of the mobile device market. So you're really, like you said, making sure that more people are secure by testing Android.
Yeah, this is definitely the goal, to have as many people.
So I'm so glad that you brought up MobSF. So have you ever done dynamic code analysis with MobSF? I always told myself, carve out some time to set up and get that working. And I know there's this whole series of steps that you need to do to get dynamic code analysis working in MobSF. Have you ever done it?
I tried it. I tried it once,
Okay.
and I had fun with it. But I realized I also, I like to do my own things, and I felt like something was taken away from me. So this is
Yeah.
really,
Yeah, I don't know. I'm all for kind of work smart, not hard, and I love that, with automation, and especially as machine learning is getting more and more advanced and sophisticated and usable. But there's definitely a lot to be said about more manual testing versus live code analysis. But I mean, it can definitely find some things that maybe you or I may not have thought about. So I appreciate that. Yeah, I know there's a whole series of steps you have to do to get that working out of the. It doesn't work out of the box like the dead code analysis does. So I always like to ask people that.
Yeah, and it really depends on how you install it. Like if you install it on Docker, you won't be able to use it. So
Right.
it can be a pain to use.
Yeah, you definitely have to compile and install everything from scratch if you want to do something like that. So if you were to boil Gabby's tactics, techniques, and procedures down to a succinct list of steps for approaching mobile API pen testing, what would that be? So if you were to just kind of go 1 through 10, these are Gabby's steps for hacking mobile APIs, what would that be?
I would first have a look at the application, how it works, like the supposed way to work for the application, because I really like to have a broad understanding of the application and what it's supposed to do in order to be able to say, this is not supposed to happen if I find something that is not supposed to happen.
Right.
So, really, that when I talk about context, I think it's really, really important because first, this is the thing that your customer, who is not technical, is going to understand the context and why they did this application.
Right.
So this way, we are able to explain, okay, I was able to do this, and this will impact this functionality, and this is probably going to be a problem in terms of security or anything. It really depends on what you found. And so, yes, so there would be see how it works, and then start to look also the technologies and what it uses and how it goes, and does it use API, and use the checklist I mentioned also, because it's really I'm someone who is going to be easily taken away on something, and so I have to have a checklist to remind myself to stay in the box and make sure that I don't forget anything.
I'm the same way. I'm like the ADD poster child, and if you're anything like me, I'm very linear when I think, and so I like to have just a linear list of, like a laundry list of steps that I try. I'll typically put that in like a spreadsheet, like Katie mentioned, and if I don't just kind of watch myself or police myself, I need a checklist. Otherwise, I'll just go down multiple rabbit holes. I think that's in any hacking, right?
Yeah, I completely agree.
What recommendation, if there's anyone in the audience right now who's like, I want to be the next Gabby, what recommendation would you give them as far as the learning path on, what they can do to get into this area of API penetration testing?
Don't give up. This is the first one I can say. Don't give up, because there is going to be a lot of people on the way who are going to tell you cannot, but you can. Yes, you can. And so don't give up, and keep on believing, and read everything you can find. What I would recommend is if you want to have some practice, you can use CTF. But also, I think if I had started now, I would use probably more bug bounty, because it's more real context.
Right.
So I would definitely use more bug bounties than CTF. But CTF is also a good way, because you actually learn, it's going to be the one vulnerability or the one thing that is very hard to trigger. So it's a way to push further your skills. So yes, a mix of both. And yeah, read everything and don't give up.
Yeah, and I know you're on the board for Apisecure University, so probably also checking out them, right? As a resource.
Definitely, it's very, very good, and you have it's all covering everything.
Yeah, definitely. And so I think, just the final question I would have, and I like to ask really all pen testers, is what's the most common vulnerability you find out there? So obviously you've done a lot of API pen tests and mobile API pen tests, mobile apps. What's your most common finding? Is it Ebola?
Yeah, it's the one.
Yeah, I figured. Either broken, object level or broken authentication. OWASP 1 and 2 from the old list. But, well, Gabby, like I said, you're a dear friend. I'm so glad that you were a part of this conference and graced our stages. So thank you so much for speaking today. How can the audience reach out to you if they want to find out more about you and stalk you on social media?
So LinkedIn, I am on LinkedIn. They can drop me a DM, and also they can check out my pen tips and my blog, and this would be a good way.
Awesome. Well, Gabby, we love you. Thank you so much for coming today and presenting, and you gave a great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Alisa.
Okay, bye-bye.